Everything carries a cost, and very few things are actually worth what we first imagine. Then life delivered Rick Harrison a string of losses so deep, so perfectly timed one after another, that no amount of deal-making experience could have braced him for what was coming. Some things, it turns out, you simply cannot value from behind a glass counter. The man the counter created. Las Vegas isn't usually known for producing people of lasting depth. It's a city designed for flash and short lifespans, a place where money, marriages, and reputations come and go at the same speed, where the buildings borrow styles from everywhere else and the legends get reinvented every few years. Rick Harrison is the rare exception to almost everything Las Vegas tends to create. He is genuinely and stubbornly built to endure. Richard Kevin Harrison was born March 22, 1965, in Lexington, North Carolina. The son of a U.S. Navy veteran, he and his father opened the gold and silver pawn shop in 1989. What started as a small 300-square-foot coin shop eventually grew into one of the most instantly recognizable businesses on the planet. Not because Rick was especially lucky, although luck showed up now and then, but because he grasped something most people only realize too late to act on it. Knowledge is the one currency that grows without ever risking loss. Harrison has called himself a complete geek, with an intense love for learning the history behind every item that crosses his counter. That passion became the heartbeat of Pawn Stars, the History Channel series that launched in 2009 and exploded across cable television like something no one had been expecting, yet everyone suddenly realized they needed. It wasn't really a show about greed, even though greed occasionally appeared in the background. It was a show about the connection between objects and time, between worth and memory, between the things people cling to and the things they eventually have to release. For 15 years Rick Harrison stood at the center of that show as its steady gravitational force, the historian, the businessman, the self-taught skeptic, the guy who had read enough to catch almost any bluff and had negotiated enough to know when a price was honest. He became famous in the exact way truly skilled people become famous on television, not through manufactured drama, but because watching someone be exceptionally good at something is endlessly captivating at its core. Then, beginning in January 2024 and stretching through the opening weeks of 2026, the man who had spent his life appraising the value of everything faced a series of personal losses so heavy that, for the first time in his adult years, the pawn shop, the television show, and the entire business empire tied to his name started to feel like the least significant parts of who he was. The son he couldn't save. Rick Harrison had 3 sons, Corey and Adam with his first wife Kim, and Jake with his second wife Tracy. Of the 3, Adam Harrison lived furthest from the public eye. Corey grew up to become a central piece of the Pawn Stars' public story. Viewers watched him mature from a young shop employee into a key figure at gold and silver pawn shop. Jake stayed mostly outside the television spotlight. Adam, however, deliberately chose to step away from the fame that swirled around Las Vegas Boulevard and his father's increasingly famous name. According to Corey in a 2016 HuffPost interview, Adam had zero interest in appearing on the show. He worked at the pawn shop for a while, then became a plumber and built a life intentionally separate from cameras and performance. By most accounts he was a private person who wanted to stay private. In light of what came later, that choice now feels both courageous and heartbreakingly fragile. The family was not blind to his struggles. Rick has spoken openly about Adam's long battle with addiction, describing a pattern painfully familiar to any parent of an addicted child. In his 20s Adam developed serious drug problems. Rick said he placed him in rehab multiple times. Each time there was real improvement. Each time there was hope. And each time, eventually, there was relapse. The cycle of recovery and collapse stretched across years, a rhythm families learn the hard way. Hope becomes careful. Optimism turns guarded. Progress is celebrated quietly, as if too much joy might somehow trigger the next fall. Rick described watching his son do well, only to slip back again. That repetition is exhausting. It wears away certainty. It leaves parents desperately searching for the one intervention they haven't tried yet. Adam Harrison died on January 19, 2024. He was 39 years old. The Clark County Office of the Coroner determined the cause of death to be fentanyl and methamphetamine toxicity. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The word accident is clean and clinical. It does not carry the weight of the years that led up to it. It does not convey the waiting, the phone calls at odd hours, the rehab stays, the cautious relief when things seemed stable for a while. Reports noted that Adam had recently been incarcerated and had moved into a guest house in the Las Vegas area shortly before his death. The timeline, from incarceration to tentative re-entry to fatal overdose, was painfully short. The fentanyl crisis has shrunk second chances into dangerously narrow windows. The drug does not wait for stability to take hold. Rick Harrison responded publicly in a way that showed a side of him rarely seen across decades of televised negotiations. Appearing on In Depth with Graham Bensinger, he spoke about thinking of his son every single day. That he admitted that losing a child forces you to second-guess everything. The word everything hung in the air, for a man famous for certainty, for precise valuations and firm counteroffers. It was a raw moment of vulnerability. Grief reshapes how you see the world. Rick had spent 35 years assessing objects, separating the replaceable from the truly rare. He had always understood intellectually that some things are irreplaceable. After January 19, 2024, he understood it in his bones that he also turned part of his grief into public advocacy. He appeared on national news programs to speak about the fentanyl epidemic, describing its devastation in blunt terms. That he called for tougher enforcement and harsher penalties for those distributing the drug. At times his language was forceful, comparing the crisis to coordinated attacks because of the sheer scale of destruction it causes. That activism was not abstract politics. It was deeply personal. Turning grief into action does not erase it. It gives it direction and purpose, but the absence remains. No policy change, no television appearance, no legislative debate brings a son back to his father. In the wake of Adam's death, friends and supporters asked how they could help. The family established an education fund for Adam's child, Rick's grandchild. It was a practical act rooted in continuity. Adam's life had ended. His child's had not. The fund honored both truths at once. Rick Harrison was 60 years old when he lost his son. He had negotiated thousands of deals, built a business from almost nothing, and weathered constant public scrutiny for years. None of that experience prepared him for the specific weight of this loss. The pawn shop doors still open every morning. Customers still arrive carrying objects and stories. Cameras still roll when needed. Rick still stands behind the counter, but there is now an invisible inventory he carries, one that cannot be appraised or placed in a display case. He once told customers he couldn't give them what they wanted because the market wouldn't support it. After January 19, 2024, he faced a reality no market can fix. Some losses cannot be negotiated. He thinks about his son every day. He said so himself. That may be the clearest valuation he has ever given. The show that went quiet. Pawn Stars had run for more than 2 decades. By the time the cracks in its foundation became impossible to ignore, the show had produced roughly 700 episodes across more than 20 seasons. It had aired in 150 countries and been dubbed into dozens of languages. What began as a modest reality experiment inside Gold and Silver Pawn Shop had grown into a global franchise. Spin-offs appeared. Merchandise followed. Tourism surged. A stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard turned into a pilgrimage site for viewers who wanted to stand where the cameras once stood and watch a negotiation happen live. It wasn't just a television program anymore, it was an entire ecosystem. Then in February 2025 the ecosystem paused. The Las Vegas Review-Journal reported that Pawn Stars was no longer under contract with History Channel and had entered what was described as an indefinite pause. After more than 20 seasons, the wording was careful, the kind of cautious corporate language used when negotiations, exhaustion, and personal circumstances collide, but the practical reality was unmistakable. One of cable television's longest-running institutions had stopped producing new episodes. Institutional breaks are rarely caused by one single event. They form where multiple pressure points meet. There was the question of Rick Harrison himself. By early 2025 he was a man carrying multiple layers of grief. He had lost his father in June 2018. He had lost his son Adam in January 2024. His public image, once defined mostly by sharp humor and deep curiosity, was now shadowed by visible sorrow. Sustaining the performance demands of a long-running franchise while carrying that kind of weight is not a small calculation. There was also Corey Harrison's departure. Corey had been far more than supporting cast. He was the generational bridge of the series. Viewers had watched him grow up on camera, negotiating authority with his father, gradually taking on more responsibility inside the shop. His arc gave the show emotional continuity. It anchored the series in something deeper than transactions. In September 2024 Corey left Las Vegas and moved to Tulum, Mexico. He later stated clearly that he would not return to the show. His explanation was direct. He could no longer keep playing a version of himself that no longer matched who he had become. That statement resonated because it exposed the central tension of long-running reality television. Eventually the character the audience expects and the person you have actually become stop aligning comfortably. Corey's exit was not just another cast change. It marked the breakdown of the dynasty narrative that had held the series together from the beginning. Pawn Stars was built on a three-generation equation: the old man, Rick, Corey. When Richard Benjamin Harrison died in June 2018, the first shift happened. When Adam died in January 2024, the private family structure fractured. When Corey stepped away later that same year, the public generational bridge collapsed. The show's planned return, now scheduled for 2027, will feature Rick and Austin Chumlee Russell as co-leads. The change is practical. It recognizes that survival requires adaptation, but it is also a quiet documentary record of how much has changed. The original formula cannot be recreated because the original people are no longer all there. Television captures continuity. Life disrupts it. Rick's response to the pause was characteristically action-oriented. In February 2025 he and Chumlee launched Pawn After Dark, a podcast recorded right in the back of the pawn shop. The shift required no elaborate set, no network deal, no large production crew, just microphones, memory, and the same room where thousands of televised negotiations had already happened. If the broadcast system paused, they built a smaller one. The podcast allowed a different tone. Stories stretched longer. Reflections went deeper. Without the rigid structure of 40-minute episodes, Rick spoke more freely about the early days of the shop, about deals that never made air, about lessons learned across decades of evaluating objects and people. Chumlee brought familiarity and lightness. The audience followed. That, perhaps, is the truest measure of staying power: not contracts, not ratings, not episode counts, but the willingness of viewers to keep listening even when the format changes. Pawn Stars in 2025 was no longer the unstoppable force of its peak years. It was older, heavier, changed. The pause did not mean irrelevance. It meant transition. Institutions built around personalities inevitably bend when those personalities change. The shop is still open. The counter is still staffed. The lights are still on. The return planned for 2027 will not recreate the past. It cannot. The old man will not be in his chair. Corey will not be at his station. Adam will not walk through the frame, but Rick Harrison is still there, standing behind the counter, reading objects, reading people, adjusting to a new equation. Franchises evolve or they disappear. Pawn Stars chose evolution. Whether that evolution can carry the same cultural weight remains to be seen. What is clear is that the institution did not fade quietly. It paused, recalibrated, and began again in a different form, for a show built on the idea that value can be rediscovered inside forgotten things. That is a fitting outcome. The mother who held everything together. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives when you lose a parent in old age. It is not the sharp, world-rearranging grief of losing a child, the kind that tears through you and rewrites the future in one brutal moment. It is quieter, more expected in theory, and therefore more haunting in reality. When a parent dies after a long life, what disappears is not only the person, but the last living witness to who you were before the world decided who you would become. Joanne Harrison was 85 years old. She had lived long enough to watch her son turn a small beginning into something culturally significant. She saw him build gold and silver pawn shop from a 300-square-foot coin operation into a landmark business. She watched Rick Harrison become one of the most familiar faces on American cable television through Pawn Stars. She witnessed the long evolution from modest storefront to cultural landmark, a life that deserved both grief and gratitude in full measure. She was also there for the private costs. She watched Rick bury his father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, in June 2018. The old man had been the visible anchor of the shop, the steady balance to Rick's quicker instincts. His death marked the end of an era that began when the store opened in 1989. Joanne lived through that transition, absorbing the silence that follows losing a partner of decades. She was also alive to witness a loss no parent should ever see in their child. In January 2024, Rick's son Adam Harrison died. The grief of that event settled heavily across the family. For a mother to watch her son bury his own child is to face a violation of the natural order. Joanne carried that knowledge through the final chapter of her life. Joanne Harrison died on November 5, 2025, at a Las Vegas hospital. The news was confirmed publicly with a note that Rick intended to keep the immediate aftermath private. The date stands out sharply on the calendar, November 5, 2025, less than 2 years after Adam. Less than 2 months before Rick would stand in a Las Vegas chapel and marry again, stepping deliberately into a new commitment while still carrying old sorrow. The compression of those events is hard to absorb without stopping to breathe. Within roughly 2 years, Rick Harrison lost his son and then his mother, layered on top of the earlier death of his father. Between those losses were public appearances, business responsibilities, interviews, negotiations, and the quiet persistence needed to keep a long-running enterprise alive. Grief does not pause invoices. It does not halt filming schedules. It does not negotiate with deadlines. Joanne's role in the public story of Pawn Stars was understated. The show focused on the shop floor, appraisals, banter, generational tension between father and son. Yet behind the visible partnership between Rick and the old man was the woman who had navigated Navy relocations, financial uncertainty, and the medical challenges that shaped Rick's childhood. Rick has spoken openly about living with epilepsy and how it changed his early education. Joanne lived through those years alongside him, carrying the worry, the adjustments, the recalibrations that define family life when circumstances refuse to stay simple. Her death at 85 was, by statistical standards, the natural close of a long life. It was not sudden in the way younger deaths feel sudden, but numbers do not lessen emotional impact. For Rick, her passing removed the final living connection to his earliest memories. There is something uniquely destabilizing about suddenly becoming the oldest living generation in your family line. The safety net of being someone's child disappears, even when you have long been an adult. By late autumn 2025, Rick Harrison was a man carrying layers of accumulated grief. His father in 2018, his son in 2024, his mother in 2025. Publicly, he remained the same negotiator America had watched for more than a decade, the man who evaluated objects with skepticism and certainty. Privately, He was navigating losses that resist any kind of appraisal. That in interviews over the years, Rick often used a familiar line at the counter: "I cannot give you what you're asking." It was always about value, about limits, about realism in a transaction. That in November 2025 the irony was impossible to miss, that he was now in possession of more loss than language can easily hold. No counteroffer could restore what time had taken, and yet, just like the business he built, life kept moving. The shop doors opened every morning. Customers arrived with objects and stories. Cameras rolled when needed. Rick moved forward, not because grief had ended, but because forward was the only direction left. There is a specific loneliness in losing a parent late in life. It is the loneliness of realizing that no one else remembers you at 5 years old the way they did. No one else carries the complete archive of your becoming. When Joanne Harrison died, Rick did not only lose his mother, he lost the last person who had known him before the empire, before the show, before the public persona. That is a loss beyond any valuation. The fourth time at the altar, he proposed at a vineyard in Casablanca, Chile. The winter light filtered softly through the vines, angled and gentle, the kind of light that makes even sudden decisions feel almost cinematic. Rick Harrison went down on one knee beneath a tree. Angie Polushkin stood in front of him, surprised and smiling. She said yes. Harrison posted the news simply on Instagram. She said yes. Polushkin later shared that they had toured a beautiful winery and that he had chosen the moment with care. The announcement came on March 6, 2025. The date sits in a narrow window of time, roughly 14 months after the death of his son Adam in January 2024, and about 8 months before the death of his mother in November 2025. The engagement lived between two major losses, framed by grief yet deliberately pointed toward continuation. The public reaction was predictable and split. Many fans responded with warmth. They had followed Harrison for years on Pawn Stars and felt genuinely invested in his happiness. Others were skeptical. This would be his fourth engagement, and potentially his fourth marriage. His previous 3 marriages, to Kim Harrison, Tracy Harrison, and Deanna Bird, had each ended in divorce. Online comments quickly turned to questions of judgment, timing, and motive. Harrison addressed it directly, in the straightforward way he usually does. Yes, he had been married 3 times before. Yes, he had proposed again. Yes, he was happy. Maybe the 4th time's the charm, he said. There was no defensiveness in the statement, only a plain acknowledgement of his own history. He also tackled the inevitable speculation about money and prenuptial agreements with a remark that revealed more about his real priorities than many of his on-camera negotiations ever did. "Money is my 3rd or 4th favorite thing in the world," he said. "But it is not everything. You can take half my money and I can still live like a king for the rest of my life." It was a practical and revealing statement. Financial security was no longer a survival issue for him. Emotional continuity was. Angie Polushkin is a nurse in Las Vegas. She is 42 years old. The age difference between them sparked the usual public commentary, speculation about intentions, cynicism about power dynamics, assertions from strangers who felt entitled to judge a relationship they did not live in. Harrison did not seem especially interested in engaging those criticisms. In the span of 2 years he had buried his son and then his mother. Perspective has a way of rearranging which voices matter. They were married on January 3, 2026, at a little white wedding chapel. An Elvis Presley impersonator officiated. The venue choice was unmistakably Harrison. No borrowed cathedral grandeur, no engineered destination spectacle for headlines, just Las Vegas performing its most iconic ritual in the most Las Vegas way possible. It was playful and sincere at the same time. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to Rick's Rollins Smoke Barbecue and Tavern, located just steps from Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. The symbolism was quiet but unmistakable. The wedding folded directly back into the geography of his life's work. Business and personal history share the same block of pavement. The guest list was small. The celebration was private. Corey Harrison publicly expressed support and indicated he would stand beside his father as best man if asked. The son who had built his own path outside Las Vegas still showed up for the moments that mattered. Even when geography changes, certain loyalties stay in place. The timing caught many people off guard. The wedding took place 3 weeks before the premiere of Pawn Stars Season 24 on January 7, 2026. The show returned with new episodes after its own period of institutional pause. The contrast was striking. A marriage barely 2 months after the death of his mother, less than 2 years after the death of his son. In the same week his television franchise re-entered the public conversation. For some the sequence felt chaotic. For others it felt coherent. Rick Harrison has always processed life through motion rather than stillness. He negotiates. He builds. He commits. When something ends, he does not stay frozen in the ending. He looks for the next structure to step into. He was 60 years old when he married Angie Polushkin. His previous marriages to Kim Harrison, Tracy Harrison, and Deanna Bird had each begun with the same conviction he later described on air: "I thought it was forever." There is a clear pattern in that statement. He does not enter relationships cautiously. He enters them completely. That tendency explains both the scale of his losses and the persistence of his hope. He gives everything. When everything fractures, he absorbs the cost. And then, eventually, he finds enough left to give again. What he still has left here is what remains in the aftermath of everything the past 2 years have taken from Rick Harrison. Gold and Silver Pawn Shop still stands on Las Vegas Boulevard, exactly as it has since 1989, welcoming strangers with their broken plans, their treasured objects, and their urgent need for someone who can tell them what something is truly worth. The shop has outlasted the old man. It has outlasted Adam. It has outlasted 3 marriages and the inevitable ups and downs of television production. It remains because Rick built it from almost nothing, and he built it with foundations that do not shift easily. Pawn Stars Season 24 is airing in February 2026. The show returns with Rick still at its center, still positioned behind the counter, still studying objects and faces with the accumulated knowledge of a man who educated himself because he genuinely loved history. The format has evolved over time. Cast lineups have changed. Production schedules have adjusted, yet the essential promise remains intact: value is knowable. History is recoverable. The past survives in the objects people bring through the door. There is a new wife. Angie Polushkin now stands beside him. Their wedding at a little white wedding chapel in January 2026 was brief, unapologetically local, and followed by a reception at Rick's Rollins Smoke Barbecue and Tavern. Steps from the pawn shop itself, life folded directly back into the geography of his daily work, without unnecessary ceremony. There is a grandchild whose education fund has already been set up. A quiet signal that Rick still thinks in generational terms, even while navigating immediate grief. There is also a podcast, recorded in the back of the shop, where Rick and Austin Chumlee Russell revisit 35 years of deals, missteps, and improbable discoveries without the tight structure of network editing between them and their listeners. The conversations are looser, less polished, but rooted in the same fascination with objects and the stories they carry. The audience followed. People showed up. That, perhaps, is the truest measure of staying power: not contracts, not ratings, not episode counts, but the willingness of viewers to keep listening even when the format changes. What has been lost cannot be restored. Adam Harrison was 39 years old when he died in January 2024. He was the son who chose not to step into the cameras, who worked in the shop for a time and then built a different path. His death came in the middle of a crisis that claims more than 100,000 American lives every year. For Rick, the statistics are irrelevant. He has said plainly that he thinks about his son every day. That repetition is its own form of memorial. It will not fade. Joanne Harrison lived to 85 and died in November 2025. in the city her son helped define for a generation of television viewers. She had seen the shop open in 1989. She had seen the cameras arrive in 2009 when Pawn Stars premiered. She had witnessed the long arc from modest storefront to cultural landmark, a life that deserved both grief and gratitude in full. Rick Harrison's father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, died in June 2018. The old man's chair remains part of the shop's mythology, even in absence. In less than a decade Rick lost his father, then his son, then his mother. The sequence is not neat. It is heavy, stripped of everything the years have taken. What remains is what existed at the beginning, an extraordinary capacity to keep going, before the television contracts, before the licensing deals, before the long lines of tourists photographing the storefront. There was a 300-square-foot coin shop and a man with insomnia, epilepsy, and an obsession with reading. Rick taught himself history because he loved it. He built a business because he believed value could be recognized where others overlooked it. He refused to accept that something was worth less than it truly was if he had the knowledge to prove otherwise. That temperament has not disappeared. It has slowed slightly. It has grown more deliberate. The man at the counter now carries grief alongside expertise, but he is still there. He still studies the patina on a rifle. He still questions provenance on a signed baseball. He still negotiates with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He still tells customers that the past matters. Some people learn that lesson from books alone. Rick Harrison learned it from 35 years of strangers placing their most important possessions on his counter. He learned that nothing is merely an object. Everything carries context. Everything carries story, even loss carries instruction. The shop continues to open each morning. The show continues to air. The restaurant continues to serve barbecue to tourists and locals alike. A child's education fund grows quietly in the background. The podcast microphone turns on. The lights over the display cases hum. What has been taken cannot be returned. What remains is motion, forward, deliberate, sometimes stubborn motion. The same instinct that built the shop in 1989 still drives the man behind the counter in February 2026. He is still reading, still negotiating, still believing that value, properly understood, can be found almost anywhere. If this chapter moved you, share it, because stories like this deserve to outlast the headlines that tried to bury them. Subscribe and stay tuned, because what comes next may be even more surprising.